this is Jill Ewing Flynn. This presentation serves as an introduction to some of the ideas that are important for developing equity literacy. We will be thinking about culture and identity. We should always be recognizing who we are as teachers and what we bring into the classroom space. As the great critical theorist Paulo Freire said, I cannot be a teacher without exposing who I am. So, our goal for you is to do some work thinking about your own identity and the cultures that you are part of. You may also find that some of these activities are ones you want to do with your own secondary students. I know I have done them with my undergraduates and also seen them done with middle school students in my research. Some guidelines. Issues like these can be difficult to talk about. Some of you and some of your students may have more practice and more comfort than others in dealing with issues of equity, but the goal is not to make everyone adopt the same opinion of equity issues, but rather to provide a space where investigation and informed knowledge can be gained. We are all learning and growing, including us as teachers. So again, these ideas and or what appears on the next slide may be helpful for you to share with your students. Glenn Singleton talks about the four agreements in his book, Courageous Conversations About Race. They are to stay engaged, to experience discomfort, knowing that sometimes those places where we experience something that's not comfortable allows us to grow, to speak your truth, to just talk about your own experience. Don't be expected to speak for all members of your group or infer things about others. And this fourth one, to expect and accept non-closure. At the end of lessons, we as teachers try to wrap things up and tie them in a bow, and sometimes with equity issues, they don't lend themselves to that. There's more to continue to explore, to consider, so to know that and accept it as part of this process. And I definitely encourage you to check out this book. So let's move on to thinking about what is culture. What are some of the elements that make up or define culture? I invite you to take a minute to pause this presentation and brainstorm a quick list for yourself. When you're ready, you can move on to the next slide. So you may have come up with these or others, things like language, customs, practices, beliefs or values, food, family structures, and social norms. One way of thinking about culture is as an iceberg, which is shown in this diagram. You can see that some elements are visible and above the surface. These are things that we can see from the outside. Things like food or drama or crafts or literature that's produced by the culture. Others are below the surface, and those are social norms like eye contact or notions of beauty, patterns of group decision making, expectations for gender roles. Those things may not be immediately apparent when we think about a culture, so feel free to pause and take some time to look at this diagram more carefully. Some key points to take away of this idea of the cultural iceberg is that first, some parts of culture are visible and observable, and other parts aren't. They are below the surface, and both can be powerful. The emotional load of different aspects of culture varies. So if you reject the food that my culture values, then that's not necessarily something that's going to inherently threaten me. But if you reject the social expectations for gender that are present in my culture, that might feel more difficult. To illustrate how some aspects can be both above and below the surface, I like to share an anecdote from one of my colleagues and her expectations about mealtime in her family. So, the above the surface parts are the behaviors or practices of discourses about dinner. So, at dinner time in her family, everyone eats together, they're expected to share conversation, everyone helps with cleanup, and those are above the surface things that you could observe. Below the surface, these practices reflect some deeply held values about the family culture, that staying connected to each other's lives is important, that they value time together, and that part of community is everyone pitching in. Another key idea is that this iceberg changes over time. Culture is a socially constructed concept, and it's influenced by contextual factors. And culture is influenced by and reflected in important societal institutions. So let's move on to talking about culture and identity. Here are some broad categories of identity frames that could relate to culture, and then some examples of groups within that frame that likely have some shared cultural aspects. So pause the presentation to take a look. This is definitely not meant to be an exhaustive list. It comes from Sensoy and D'Angelo's work, which is cited in our final reference slide. So now I'd like you to think of an example from your own family or friend group that shows an aspect of this group's culture. Is this an above the surface or a below the surface element, or is it both? And then thinking more broadly, what are some of the categories or frames that are important to you in shaping your cultural practices? Some key ideas to take away a discussion of identity and culture. The first is that we all experience complex intersectionality of cultural groups and identities. Different identities might have more salience for different people. We may have more awareness of our own cultures or identities that are marginalized and not notice as much our identities or cultures that have privilege. Cultural groups and identities are valued differently, and their power to shape larger cultural norms varies. And finally, members of cultures don't automatically accept and practice all of the aspects of that culture. We as individuals are shaped but not defined by culture, and we have agency and can actively choose to accept, reject, or negotiate facets of cultures that we belong to. I start the year by having my students make a name tag that has their name and represents the cultures or identities that they identify with. I invite them to consider race, religion, profession, age, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, ability status, region of a state, city, or country, and so on. I encourage them to focus on cultures rather than having a list of activities. So, if a student plays the clarinet, that's an activity, but what does it mean to be part of the culture of marching band, for example? They present their name tag to their classmates and they explain what's represented there. And this, again, is something you can do with your students. I explain it more in a publication that's listed in the reference resources. It gets us starting thinking about our identities and is something that we will build on in the following presentation. Next up, we'll be examining issues of positionality, our professional obligation as teachers to address issues of equity in our classroom, and then terminology like equity and equity literacy and their definitions. I'd like to give a thank you to my colleagues Rosalie Roland-Dow and Lynn Warden. We worked together to create a lot of the material in this presentation and use it with our students. I also want to thank Erin Bogger and the rest of the 2018 Partnership for Public Education Equity team, Chanel Wilson, Elizabeth Soslow, and Roger Carey. I drew on some of that material as well in preparing this presentation. And here are some references of things that I've talked about and that you can explore in further depth. Thank you.